Firstly, welcome to the Cartoon Museum. My name's Joe, I'm the museum's director. I've just realised my biography is a little bit too long to read out loud, so I'll be editing that. Hopefully you all or some of you had a chance to walk around the museum a little bit earlier today and see the kinds of things that we've got on display here. We're the only cartoon museum in the UK. We've got a breadth of collections that spans 320 years of cartooning and comics and caricatures. We're kind of like the home of cartooning in Britain. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the role of cartooning, how important it can be for kind of conversations and building trust, but also touch on the role of museums in doing that and why museums are really important cultural spaces for having conversations and kind of building trust with different people. The only other thing I want to mention is there's not a fire alarm that's expected, but if there is, follow me out the door and I'll show you where the fire exit is. I'm just going to start with this quote. It's from Kofi Annan, who, this is a quote from the Cartoon for Peace's first roundtable. Cartoons make us laugh. Without them, our lives would be much sadder. But they're no laughing matter. They have the power to inform and the power to offend. And this the kind of knife edge between cartooning and why potentially it causes issues, but why it can be such a powerful tool for people expressing themselves and sharing their stories. Now, I kind of mentioned our collections a little bit. They cover caricature, they cover comics, things like Beano, very famous, and also kind of really touch on social issues, like Richard Dixon, very famously, but also they're just sometimes funny. So this cartoon at the bottom is just a big joke cartoon. And it's a nice thing about cartoons. They kind of run the full gamut from, very serious, very important topics, all the way through to jokes about moles. They cover all of that sphere. And the great thing about comics and cartoons, from my perspective, you can see the difference in the art style here, right? So this is an early caricature of Edward VIII on the arse of Albion, kind of satirising him. This was done by someone trained by the Royal Academy, whereas Tony Husband is a was a self-taught illustrator. You can see the difference in the ability levels, but they can still get their message across. The important thing to remember about cartooning as an art form is about 50% of it is art, and 50% is the joke or the point you're trying to make. So you can be a brilliant artist, but a rubbish cartoonist. You can be a brilliant cartoonist without being an excellent artist. And that's why it's so important to remember this is an art form. Anyone can pick up a pencil and draw something, and they can communicate their stories with. And it's why if you have wandered around the museum today, you'll have seen that we've got quite a few stations where you can draw in the museum. You might have, if you came a little bit earlier, seen we had a workshop going on in this room where we're teaching, I think it was a create your own comic workshop today. But this is a huge part of our work, and it's something always to remember about cartooning. Anyone can do it, and it's a tool that anyone can use. Now, there's two things that really underpin how we approach our work here. Laughter and speaking truth to power is an important part of cartooning, an important part of our collections. Everyone can use cartoons and caricature to tell their story. And this kind of resulted in our overall museum's vision. We want to create a world where anyone, whoever they are, from whatever background they are or whatever age they are, can pick up a pencil and draw something. This is the key message behind every piece of work we do here at the museum. Now, cartoonists, they kind of consider themselves the outsiders of journalism, right? So journalists, they write huge, long pieces, lots and lots of words, and they're all very long words, and, they're doing all the research. Cartoonists often just sit in their maybe garden shed or their studio at home. Just as an aside, apparently COVID was fine for cartoonists because their work didn't change because they sat at home on their own anyway. So it gives you a bit of an insight into how they feel very separate from journalism. They feel very separate, but it's still very important and notable part of a newspaper when you pick one up. But because of this, cartoonists aren't always necessarily treated seriously. So this is a quote from Martin Rosen. It's a systemic failure in newspapers to appreciate cartoons are a serious part of journalism. Okay, there's 300 years in the UK at least of a free press, and we used that free press to have funny or silly pictures that hold the powerful to account, that mock the powerful, kings and queens and governments. But cartoons are not always treated particularly seriously. Now, this is a point I'm going to come back to in a second. The thing is, they should be, and these are a few reasons why they should be. Number one, they predict the future. So this is a quote from a 1979 Judge Dredd story. If you're not familiar with Judge Dredd, it's a comic book character from 2000 AD, a futuristic policeman. It's the iron fist of the law. Let every man know citizenship is a privilege, not a right. And in 2021, our Conservative Home Secretary said basically the same thing when she was putting her borders bill together. Okay, so this is satire. This is reality. This is satire 30, 40 years before the reality came to bear. So cartoons really are important and powerful in their messaging. there's a few reasons for this. And I always use this cartoon as a specific example because I'm from East London. My dad was born on the Mile End Road. And this is a cartoon from the 1980s about the rise of far-right fascism in the East End among the working class. And it's something, obviously, I'm sure you wouldn't pay attention to the news, has had resurgences recently. The thing about this is, like, for me particularly, this is a very local thing because of its situation. This is a cartoon, a single image, right? It's just a few figures, and it tells you exactly what you need to know, from the clothing, from the positioning, all of that kind of stuff. It communicates a message of who these people are. But underneath, it says, Wayne's made his first racist remark, which is genuinely, bleakly, quite a funny joke. And this is the thing that cartoons do. They put all of this stuff into one still image. They can be genuinely funny, but also they're commenting on a really depressing, bleak social issue. And sometimes it's a social issue that is really, really close to home. So it does all that in a still image. You don't have to read a long kind of article. You don't have to read think pieces. This tells you exactly what you need to know very quickly. The other thing about cartooning is it's an outsider art form. Not really done by the powerful. It's done by anyone. As I mentioned several times, anyone can do this stuff. And it's also very self-expressive. So some of you might be familiar with V for Vendetta. If you're not, you may recognise the mask as the Guy Fawkes mask you might see on protests and things like that. There's a British comic written by Alan Moore, drawn by Dave Lloyd. And he basically, we did an exhibition on this about 3 years ago, he basically kind of compared how comic artists tell stories to a film. And in a film you have a scriptwriter and you have cameraman, you have all these different people, all these different jobs to tell that story in the film. When you've got a comic or a cartoon, you're the only person there. You might have a script if you've got a writer, or you might be the writer yourself, and you create everything, or the set design, the way the characters are posed, the way they move, the way they communicate. And it can be really transferred easily into just everyday stuff. I saw this today, actually, and put this in. I'm an Arsenal fan. Sorry if you're a Spurs fan. I'm an Arsenal fan. And this is just about an upcoming Arsenal transfer, but it does the exact same point, right? By looking at this, you see exactly what they're saying, right? And this is, I mean, it's essentially what evolved into memes, cartoons, but, you know, it's a still image, you can see someone, bang, that's your story, in 6 panels, 3 of which are exactly the same. That's what cartoons can do, and that's why they can be done by anyone. And so that means they can tell relatable stories. So cartooning, and particularly comics actually, is becoming a huge kind of cultural movement, particularly among younger people and people who are from backgrounds that generally don't engage with the arts, at least in the UK. So lower minority communities, a lot more women and girls, LGBT community, people that generally have historically felt less represented by, you know, cultural collections. And, you know, I'll hold my hands up in the same way every museum in the UK. I think 87% of white men over a certain type of art, which means our collection is generally a certain type of art about certain people and certain topics. And that doesn't represent everyone, as I'm sure you all know. Comics are a really powerful tool for a lot of people who don't feel represented by what they see on the walls in a museum sometimes to tell their own stories. So this is a page from Barking by Lucy Sullivan, which is a graphic novel about mental health and her own experience of depression and mental health issues. It's by Carol Isaacs, who's the chair of the Professional Cartoonist Organisation in the UK, and about her leaving Baghdad. It's called The Wolf of Baghdad. And this is a piece of reportage by a cartoonist called Ella Barron, whose name has somehow come off the slide. Ella Barron's a cartoonist for The Guardian. And she went to, I can't remember where it was in Africa. It was, there was a village in Africa. She was working with Doctors Without Borders. And she went to interview the people in the hostels and the hospitals there. And the reason she was brought over to draw them and meet them and tell their stories and all that kind of stuff is because she wasn't a photographer. And they felt photography was too bleak in those situations. It was too stark. It felt too alien. But she was able to spend time chatting to people, spend the actual time drawing them, which takes obviously longer, but use that time to make a stronger relationship. So Doctors Without Borders and other similar organisations take cartoonists to report back on things. So they can tell lots of different stories. I think one of the most relatable situations that I think we've all gone through is obviously COVID. Again, if you've been in the museum galleries, you may have seen we've got a wall of COVID cartoons. And these are just a few of them, but these are completely universal things, right? These are instantly relatable to everyone that was alive in the last 4 or 5 years, right? We all went through this really difficult situation, but they again cover huge amounts of opinions, approaches, you know, stories. This is about the fears of going back to school. You know, I've got kids, you know, I was obviously sort of worried about that. This is about someone wanting to date, you know. This is about a political cartoonist really trying to hold our government to account on the way they handled the situation, all using the same approach, all using the same tools. You know, it kind of crosses that. So I'll come back to this. This is the last sentence of the Martin Rosen quote that I put up before. Cartoons, and naturally cartoonists, aren't taken too seriously. Now, I feel like I've demonstrated very quickly, at least, cartoons should be taken seriously. They can be used in so many ways to tell different stories, represent people, but sometimes they aren't until they are. And when they are taken seriously, we sometimes have major, major problems. And some of these incidents, I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. I'm sure most people will be aware of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015. The cartoon shown by teachers for the Prophet Muhammad in schools. And the kind of the reaction to that from certain people and groups and things. You know, this is from cartoons. You know, this is when cartoons that traditionally toe that line, you know, they benefited in many countries and definitely in the UK of the freedom of the press, and sometimes they toe over the line because they're trying to be provocative and they get huge backlash. And this has happened for a long time. This is a cartoon from the Second World War. It's by David Lowe. David Lowe is from New Zealand. He did loads of cartoon characters of Hitler and Stalin. He was the only artist on Hitler's death list. So if the UK had been invaded, David Lowe would have been on the list. Because, and this is, I don't know the exact quote, but Hitler is reported to say, David Lowe's cartoons did more damage to me than the RAF did, apparently. But, you know, they do have power. And people do get held to account for this. Now, we're really lucky in the UK. We've had a free press for 320 years. There have been times when cartoonists have been bought off because the royals didn't want them to, you know, caricature them in certain ways or situations. But in many countries, and you know, I talk to people in cartoon museums and organisations all over the world, and I've heard from certain countries, you know, there are things you can't say, there are things you can't do, and sometimes this does result in people being arrested, people being sentenced for crimes for a long time. There's another example here. This is the cartoonist who was from Bangladesh, who was tortured while he was being held by the government. The writer he was working with was executed. Well, not executed, sorry, I shouldn't say executed. It was killed under arrest, I think. I don't know what the best term would be, but you know, these have serious consequences, and it's because it's so tied into free speech. And there's an organisation called Cartooning for Peace who want to kind of challenge us and make sure there's support to cartoonists and artists who do sit on that line, trying to hold the powerful to account using their art. In Cartooning for Peace, I showed a quote earlier from Kofi Annan, who was on the first kind of meeting and panel for that. And it was essentially established to provide a network, very similar to what's going on today and over the next few days actually, of people to meet and discuss where they might have cultural, ideological differences and use kind of art to bridge those gaps and create understanding there. They obviously kind of advocate for cartoonists who are being either tried or imprisoned or, you know, affected by government policies and things like that. And the world's getting more divisive, and this is a really specific, close-to-home example, and it kind of touches what I said about the role of museums in this, because our history, particularly in the UK, is very coloured by our colonial history. And museums in the UK are trying to challenge this. You know, they're trying to look at their collections. Who's missing from these collections? What stories are we not currently telling historically? Where do we need to kind of understand what we have so we can proactively try and fill those gaps? And you get sometimes huge backlash just for doing that. So we decided, 2020, 21, when not long after I started, we wanted to audit our collection, look what was in it, and find out where there were gaps in it where we could proactively collect stories, artists and people that weren't featured. And this is some of the backlash that we got. So people literally saying, oh, we're appeasing Black Lives Matter by trying to work out if our collection should maybe have more women in it than it does already, because women are 50% of the world. Or someone like Lawrence Fox is kind of tweeting stuff about us. Or I get my picture in The Sun, which is a horrible little newspaper if you know about UK newspapers. Or sometimes you come up against genuine racists using this as ammunition to kind of fuel hatred. And this is from a museum that has, you know, 30,000 visitors a year. We lose money every year. We're a tiny organisation. We've got 5 staff members. You know, we go, oh, who have we not got on our walls? And we try to make some kind of progress, and you still get this kind of backlash, you know. So the whole kind of cultural sector sits on that knife edge in the way cartooning and cartoon art does at times. However, I will just point out, this is one of my favourite things I've read since I've been in this job. The Cartoon Museum should be about the art, not the politics, which I thought was hilarious, because how do you divide the two in a place like this? So, using cartoons to create trust, dialogue and understanding. So this is kind of bringing together some of the things I've raised. And I think one of the key points I always try to remember, working within the sector that I do, is museums are incredibly important and valuable places to have these conversations, because people trust us. So surveys in America and Australia and other places, they always find that museums and similar cultural venues come very, very close to the top for trusted institutions. So essentially the things that we put on the walls, the stories that we think people should see, and the opinions that we try to get people to understand and discuss while they're here, are things people genuinely take on board and respect and listen to. Which means we've got a huge amount of power in a place like this to talk about certain issues and to make sure that people are discussing those issues. The other thing is, I kind of mentioned this, like museums generally have a bit of a backlog of colonial history. And a lot of our collections, and not specifically in this museum, we're a lot younger than somewhere like the British Museum, but a lot of the collections of some of those bigger museums have just been stolen, you know, from other places, and they've been brought back here and we've gone, we're still looking at them, you kind of can't have them back. And a lot of that was done to create an other, to create, this is different, this is something to look at, and not, this is something to genuinely investigate, understand, build relationships. Sorry, I've come too far from the mic, haven't I? Sorry. It doesn't have to be like this, is the kind of the point. We don't have to be kind of bound by what museums have done, have always done. We've got the opportunity and the trust to think in different ways and try to have conversations with people. So what we do at the Cartoon Museum is we try to actively platform and actively challenge some of those things and try to create opportunities for people to discover new things here. So we run events and like this book launch here, Single Mothering, that's looking at the experience of being a single mum. We display artwork that actively challenges current political events and not necessarily nails our colours to a mast, but does present them in a specific way. And a good example of this actually, during the pandemic, we lost 2 of our staff members to COVID. And one of our artists that we had on the walls at the time was a massive anti-vaxxer. And, you know, vaccines are horrible, we shouldn't have vaccines. And we made the decision to take that art down because we felt it wasn't appropriate to have on display here, because by putting it on the walls, we were saying this is someone that you should respect the views of because we respect them enough to put on the wall. Now that's not to say that's the correct decision. That's to say that was my decision, but this is kind of how we want to approach these things. It's important to have dialogue, it's important to understand, but sometimes there's a limit that we feel that we need to maintain people's trust in us by making certain decisions. Other things we do is we do a lot of autism work. So this down here is our young autistic cartoonist in residence, Jador. You might see some of his work around the galleries with purple labels. Baba, who we did a small exhibition with about, he saw the film Black Panther and went, this isn't how African talk because I'm from Nigeria, so this doesn't feel right. And he built this whole kind of comic universe of African superheroes based on mythology. We do a small press day, so this was last weekend. We brought loads of artists in who are either unpublished or they publish their own stuff, and we gave the public opportunity to talk to them and find what they were doing. So we tried to create these opportunities for people that people might not have come across their stories or their views or all that kind of stuff, so that people can experience them when they visit the museum. And we've experimented with other ways of doing this. This is an exhibition we had called Laughter Lab, and we basically took our art, we paired it A and B, no context to it at all, no detail, no text or anything, but it meant people went round and talked to each other about which was funnier. Was A or B funnier? And why? Why did that make you laugh? And it gets to the heart of how you can use these things with very, very little interpretation on the history of it to get people talking to each other about something. And just a couple of last things about sort of how you get understanding from taking these steps. So this is our permanent autism comic. Autistic artists create this. Her name's Rebecca, and it's a guide that people can use to understand what to expect when they come to the museum, what kind of things they'll see. And we have quite a few interventions around the museum, like headphones by the toilet, that have got people asking us why we do that. Why is there a comic for autistic people? Why are there headphones? It gives us the opportunity to talk about sensory issues, about expectations, and all that kind of stuff. This is another example. This is project we did called Life Under Lockdown, where we worked with local young people in Westminster to create cartoons and comics that told their stories of the COVID pandemic and lockdown, something generally you don't come across. You know, if you're reading the papers, you're seeing artists or whoever it might be telling their stories. You're not seeing 7-year-olds from, you know, an estate in Westminster. And I think this was a really powerful story. I thought was really interesting. We did an exhibition about 2021, I think it was, and it was about the comic V for Vendetta, and it looked a lot at protest. And we worked with people who'd been part of different protests. And I was quite keen that, you know, it was very easy to get people like Ocean Rebellion on board and all that kind of stuff. It was really hard to get anyone who was protesting something like Brexit. And when I talked to other museums that are collected and talked to people around Brexit, they were basically like, the problem is, there's loads of questionable people and you might not want to engage with them. And it was really hard to find someone who wasn't, let's say, questionable in some of their opinions. And as I mentioned, that's not the sort of thing we always want to platform. However, this guy, Milos, he was from the former Yugoslavia. He's from Croatia, ethnically. And he absolutely hated the European Union, or hates the European Union. He's a British citizen, but like I said, moved over here and been naturalised. He basically was like, this feels like Yugoslavia to me. I grew up under a dictatorship that pushed lots of countries into one small place. I felt like the EU was going the same way, and that's why I've been protesting. And it's something really interesting to me, because my opinion was that I didn't think we should leave the EU. But it was very, very interesting to talk to someone and go, well, I can completely see why you might say that. You know, I don't necessarily agree, but I completely see, you know, why you might think that. And the interesting thing is he was a fan of comics who used cartoon and comic artists to create his posters. So you can see one just down the bottom here. And we featured his story as part of the exhibition. And kind of platforming people that, you know, maybe sometimes you don't come across the experiences of on the walls of museums, primarily because museums and the culture sector is quite left-leaning. It was really important to me to try and create an opportunity for visitors. So that's kind of it from me. I think we've got time for like questions and stuff. So it's a nice thing about working in a cartoon museum is there's a cartoon for everything, including do you have questions. But thanks for listening to me, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you. So I've only been here since 2020, but the museum was established in 2006, and it was an arts trust before. In 1988 it was formed. So it was originally formed by people basically saying cartoon art is really important and part of British history and we need to preserve it. So they put their collections together, did a few pop-up exhibitions over the years and fundraised for a venue in 2006, moved to this one in 2019, and I started in 2020. And I kind of primarily started, this is really to the side of this topic or anything, I primarily started here because I was working at the Natural History Museum and I was frustrated not being able to change things quickly, because there's 1,000 people that work at the Natural History Museum and there's like 5 here. So it's a lot easier to make change, the changes you want to make when you have the power to do it sometimes. So. And did you say misrepresenting? I mean, it's tricky, like, because cartoon art particularly is kind of democratic in the way it's made, it always depends on your view of whether something's being misrepresented or not. Do you know what I mean? And I think sometimes things are deliberately over-egged because they're essentially caricatured. Sometimes people are having their own political agenda and they'll make things appear in certain ways. But it's kind of the same in any reporting format, in the way that like a newspaper might lean left or right. They will cover a story in a certain way, or they'll bury a story that they might otherwise put on the front page. So like my kind of view is where it's a personal thing and where it's sort of essentially the individual's editorial decision, I kind of look at it of going, we try to cover all bases as a museum and tell as complete a story as we can until we hit the real extremes. And that's where I become uncomfortable necessarily platforming that. But I don't think it's really my position to disagree with someone's opinion and then say, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. I might personally disagree with something, but I think people kind of use either any art form or whatever to make their point, even if they're maybe exaggerating or sometimes lying as part of that. And I think that's past cartooning. It's not just this as an art form. Again, it's quite difficult to say, isn't it? Because it depends on your definition of misrepresenting. There's been cases where people have felt they were misrepresented and they've tried to sue the cartoonist. This has happened maybe 4 or 5 times in history, I think. One of them was one of our trustees, a guy called Steve Bell. And basically, I mean, in that case, he had drawn a cartoon of someone who was really anti-LGBT, like publicly, and he'd drawn them as a gay man, and the person had got really infuriated with it and tried to sue him. And essentially, Steve Bell went, freedom of the press. And that's kind of such a governing thing in the UK that if you're not causing essentially reputational damage by genuinely like misrepresenting someone, like falsely attributing things to them and committing slander, you can kind of get away with it. And cartooning sits right on the knife edge a lot of that time, a lot of those times between deliberately provoking people but still staying the right side of freedom of press. So there's not really been cases of it specifically. There have been cases where people have felt that has happened, but their cases have been thrown out and not gone through. Yeah. But again, I kind of mentioned this when I was talking, that's kind of a privilege of being in the UK. You know, that's not something that's shared universally. And I obviously talked about a few examples, but we're all going to be very aware of countries and governments and systems which are more prohibitive than the UK. So we sit slightly apart from some of that. Yeah. Well, they definitely do. I mean, a lot of that comes back to particularly like the Second World War, where cartoons started to be using more as propaganda. So you may have seen again in the galleries, but generally the posters that are like, it's like Hitler's watching you kind of thing, like watch what you're saying in public, that sort of thing. And because it kind of started to be used in more of those ways, they simplified the art form so it'd be more recognisable, which is a lot of the reason why the messages get hit so much quicker now, because the style's changed to essentially inform that. And yeah, I mean, my view on that specific comment about politics and cartooning being separate things, I think in British history we would kind of consider political and satirical cartooning a native UK art form, because we've had the freedom of the press for so long, and cartooning went along with essentially the rise of that it's developed in a way that it hadn't been able to in other countries. So separating cartooning and political cartooning in the UK is a really hard thing. And you do get cartoons that tell other types of stories, but the politics is pretty inherent in most of the historical stuff in the UK. The other side of it is kind of a definition of what is political, because there's a very fair comment to say anything is political if it's your viewpoint and you'd like to defend that or debate it. And so it might not be a political topic as in a political party or a government or, you know, a monarchy or something. It might be something completely different, but it might still, by your, you know, you kind of pushing it yourself, become a political point for you to discuss. So you know, again, I've said a few times, it's an art form that is so insular to a single person. It's like an outsider, street level art form that anyone can do, which means anyone's view is going to be communicated, and someone's going to disagree with someone's views, which makes it a political thing, you know. So, yeah, I think it's inseparable in a way.
I think we probably should conclude, because I know you're a limitation on time as well. But thank you so much for
No worries.
joining us today and for your speech. Please, a second
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay.